Good morning, everybody. My focus in the presentation will be to kind of complement what Heather Mack has pointed out from her retailer perspective. And what I would like to do is to show you that sustainability standards indeed go far beyond the Twitter and the Facebook sphere. In fact, I'll try to parallel the talk a little bit to what Richard Saxon in the plenary said yesterday on the characteristics of modern agriculture markets: competition, product differentiation in terms of product standard differentiation, responses to market conditions, and responses to heterogeneous consumer demands. But before I do any of this, I got stuck on the word sustainability right from the bat. So I'll try to define it a little bit and point out some things here. So sustainability is deeply rooted in ecology, and what it basically means is the longevity of diverse and healthy ecosystems. And that is not a far stretch away from the definition of sustainable agriculture, which is farming in ecological principles to maintain soil fertility and healthy environment in which agriculture takes place over the long term. But then I went on and I thought, okay, now look for sustainable food and who defines it and what does it mean? And my search kind of got stuck, and there's a funny story to it which I can share later on. It would take too much time to share that now. But what I did find when I went to the farmer's market 2 weeks ago with my latte in one hand and my little daughter in the other hand is the following. This is South Australia, the city of Adelaide, and one of its many farmers markets that have sprung up in recent years. And as you look at the attributes of this farmers market, you're blown away, and I was blown away for sure, because this farmers market has everything that you could be looking for. And sustainability is one of the attributes, the fringe attributes, if you wish. And I entered the farmers market, and it got even better. This is the meat stand in the farmers market. Certified biodynamic, grass-fed, hormone-free, chemical-free, humane treatment of the animals, local, think food miles, and the ultimate in sustainability. So we're not talking sustainability, we're talking sustainability squared here. And so that really got me motivated to dig a little deeper into what is it about sustainability standards that make them maybe different from other standards that we heard about this morning in the food safety sphere. So as Heather pointed out, there are several standards that are fairly well known when it comes to sustainability, and all of these standards share 3 pillars that have been defined by the UN World Summit in 2005, and that is improvements in environmental or maintenance of environmental quality, social equity, and economic prosperity. So economics is an integral part of the definition of sustainability as it is used in the food market. And I'm going to use these standards, which all happen to be active in the international coffee market, as examples. And I'm going to underpin my arguments with several studies from the literature that have conducted interviews with experts, either in industry or the certification industry, to kind of support my arguments a bit. So why certify sustainability standards? And this is actually quite similar a little bit to the rationale that we talked about in the food safety session this morning. There's this general shift from government regulation to industry self-regulation in sectors or in the trade context through private voluntary standards. And especially in sustainability, which is not necessarily a core attribute of food consumption, trade, or production, there's certainly a lack of government regulation. And in fact, there's a lack of regulation transnational. So industry partnerships go out and make their own rules of engagement in the international markets, and that's where voluntary sustainability standards come into play. But the thing that's very special and that distinguishes sustainability standards from all these other standards that we have heard about and that we're familiar with is they try to standardize in a consensus way norms of ethical behavior, human rights, and environmental responsibility, which are per se very hard to grasp. But in a different context, sustainability standards are not very different from other forms of certification and standardization in the sense that they try to give us a better handle on searching for credence attributes. Is it in the product? Is it in the process of production? Or is it in the environmental or social implications that come along with the product? So they're trying to give us more information where we typically find huge gaps when we look at an apple or we look at a package of coffee in terms of its attributes that go beyond the search and the experience attributes. In another way, and Heather alluded to that already, certification of sustainability standards is also a pay-to-play game that industries and companies engage in. I'm going to use two examples, one very briefly, and that's the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, in which Canada has a nice stake. It's very young, 2012, and I'm going to use most of my examples around the global coffee industry and how its sustainability standards and certification have evolved over the last basically 30 years almost. So Global Roundtables of Sustainable Beef, very young initiative. There's not much I can say other than to show you the stakeholders that are involved in the process. And you see on the right-hand side a little bit, the Canadian Cattlemen Association is one of the bigger stakeholders in this process. Certainly, and the drivers I made up, I'm not 100% sure, but I think this is pressures within the industry to respond to increasing consumer concerns. NGOs are stepping up, put pressure on the industry. Media is putting more attention to topics of sustainability, maybe around animal welfare and other things as well. We have to feed 9 billion people, and they also are supposed to eat meat, and the Amazon is cut down to have Brazilian cattle, some say. So these are all certainly things that industry wants, the global industry wants to respond to, and I've put down the vision and the mission statement of the Global Roundtable. This is certainly going to be an interesting story to follow over the coming years and to see how this big group of partners that are engaged in this process collaborate to achieve their sustainability goals. What I want to focus more on is the global coffee industry, which I think is a prime example to see how sustainability standards can evolve in an industry that is inherently very diverse in terms of the nature of the production and economy, the production and export countries, and those countries that import all the coffee roasted and largely consume it. It all started in 1989 with the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement, which threw the producing countries and its producers, its small-scale producers, into havoc. Price tumbles from $1.20 to 55 cents. Producer conditions deteriorate, market oversupply occurs through the entry of new producers such as Vietnam and Brazil, and Western consumers get cold feet about the consequences of the coffee they are enjoying. And it starts with actually NGO organizations stepping up and putting on a media campaign against the major coffee roasting companies and marketers in the Western economies and pointing out the use of child labor, the social inequality related to coffee production, and the environmental destruction that goes along with the production techniques that were used in the 1980s and 90s. And out of these stakeholder initiatives comes a process in which, very similar to what we see on the beef side, is multiple stakeholders all along the supply chain of coffee get together with NGOs and with others to try to do something about it. And the outcome of this process are, in fact, these three examples that I'm using here, but many more. That's fair trade, that's UTSCAPI, and the community of coffee producers, the common code for coffee producers, the 4C label. So Heather started talking about this. It's interesting to know that all these three different standards share the three pillars of environmental quality, social equity, and economic prosperity. But they are highly differentiated because they are operating in a market sphere where they have to look for supplies, they have to look for their demand. They're differentiated by the countries that they target, the producers in those countries that they are after, the consumers and customers in these supply chains that they want to work with, the stringency levels that they apply in terms of the rigor of how much they want to see producers to comply on economics, on social, or on environmental. Some have a specific sustainability focus, others you might characterize more as environmental standards and so on. And here's my first quote that I picked up from a study that said, standards compete just like companies. They invest a lot of money in marketing in those standards. They just like a brand. And if you look at some of the brands, how they are portrayed in the market space, you can totally understand that they are a brand in itself. So they want to team with the right brands in the marketplace to be perceived by customers, B2B, or by consumers, B2B, as to be a quality attribute in itself, and making sustainability something that people are willing to pay for and that people demand, rather than seeing as an extra add-on on the back of the package. For fair trade, for instance, as part of this differentiation process, and I may be contrasting a little bit here with what Heather said in terms of recent developments, fair trade distinguishes itself from others by exclusively focusing on small farmers and if possible, those that are organized in little cooperatives. And in fact, this statement says from an expert that knows about fair trade more than I do, that producers actually don't have to do a lot, but they have to be small and they have to be in cooperatives, and then we will get to them, and then we will try to pull them into the fair trade label. It's quite a bit different for the USCAPE system, which said, okay, we originally oriented ourselves along the Max Havelaar model, which is a standard that's used in the Netherlands, or has been used in the Netherlands, and they built on that vision. But they also realized if we wanted to capture some market share, we have to differentiate ourselves in a very competitive way from fair trade and other standards to find a room in that marketplace for our standard and to be able to grow our standard. And so they ended up on the Ballisto candy bar after many years of work. And again, it's quite different for the 4C label, which said we developed the standard in explicit dialogue with our partners, and we looked at all the other standards, including at the time the Starbucks Cafe standard that had been coming out, so quite a while into the process. And we sorted out, we ranked all their their 3-pillar characteristics, and then we discussed this with our stakeholders, and that's how we developed the 4C standard. And this standard is, by its own definition, a base standard. They said we don't want to be inventing something new that goes beyond what others develop. We want to provide a baseline, a starting point for producers that want to be certified sustainable. So this is basically the standard you have to have, and then you can add on others as you're trying to develop your sustainability profile in the marketplace. The other interesting, so we have differentiation, we have competition, but we also see convergence. Standards, like Heather pointed out, are trying to be closely aligning themselves to be more attractive and to capture a higher market share, because it's certainly standardization, certification. It is about adding extra cost to an already competitive marketplace for producers. So it's about becoming more aligned, it's about equalizing requirements a little bit, and to adopt each other's practices in terms of standard setting. Standards vary quite a bit in terms of target and penetration in several markets. For instance, fair trade has fairly high adoption rates in Colombia and Brazil and Indonesia. Vietnamese coffee is not certified at all so far by any of the sustainability labels. Certification doesn't operate outside the rules and structure of the regular supply chains, and therefore it's not a surprise to hear and read here on the slide research from Levy indicating that it is the powerful roasters that control large sections of the supply chain, if it's not the retailers on top of that, that have a major say in which standards are adopted, which standards they want for their supply chain, that goes well along with their own brands in major markets in Europe and North America for sure. But there's also an interesting consumer-driven process in the terms that standard demand is basically can be seen as a marketing tool that fits into the marketing strategy of a certain roaster or a retail brand that is dependent, the standard pick, so to say, is dependent on the standard preferences consumers might have. So are they familiar with a certain label that is on a package? Have they heard about a certain standard or not? And certainly the brand this label is going to be working with. What's the brand position of this label? Is this a premium brand? Is this a regular day-to-day consumer brand, and so on? So consumers have different demands, and therefore standards are not necessarily in direct competition, eating away market share from each other. And like Heather had her nice graph, they are complementing themselves and adding market share one on top of another. And therefore, they're operating almost parallel to each other, covering different niches, and that conversion picture fits quite well to that joint niche operation, therefore capturing a certain market share of their potential market share among all consumers. One example is of the convergence, alliance, and change in the use of sustainable standards is that Starbucks, for instance, typically only used its self-certified coffee from its own supply chain, but recently has increasingly bought fair trade and organic coffee in response to market and consumer demands that came to their supply chain and said we need to have fair trade and organic as additional attributes in our coffee that we sell in our coffee shops. So the question begs, what's next in terms of sustainability standard? I'm arguing, and I find it personally quite interesting from a research perspective, that we see a huge increase in literature in terms of simple labels that give consumers easy to understand and easy to process cues about quality, safety, and other attributes, and sustainability would certainly fall into that sphere. Food miles, eco or CO2 labeling are some of these examples that have been studied recently. But here we have highly complex standard systems that are very hard to portray to consumers beyond that certain simple label that they're using. So the question that I'm asking is there going to be a reversal in the proliferation of some of these standards? So I showed to you here 3. Right now we have about 500 plus sustainability standards worldwide across all industries, including standards for organic and eco-labeling standards that are quite prevalent in fisheries. The question is, are we going to see that reversal, or are we adding more standards as there's more consumer interest into sustainability? The umbrella organization for sustainability standards, ISAL-AGUS, we cannot continue to have this uncoordinated proliferation of standard systems. That's going to be a challenge that they are jointly working on with the existing sustainability standards to reverse. On the other hand, when colleagues of ours, so to speak, talk to an expert, he said or she said, there's simply no interest in consolidation. Why would somebody give up their own standard to consolidate with another standard? So the question is, what would be consolidated on? Would it be the social piece? Would it be the environmental piece? Or would it be the economic prosperity piece? So certainly there's not going to be a willingness to just give up the fair trade label and have another label take over. And that emphasizes the competitive element in the marketplace as well. So standard setting and certification, like we heard this morning, is certainly not a cost-free business. It costs a lot of money. So all of these standards have to be able to earn a premium in the marketplace to justify their existence, and this will not be getting easier into the future. So I'm asking, how long will these price premiums be able to cover costs as more and more product may be certified in this direction, and premiums will have to come down to attract more consumer demand? How much product, how much food will we want to label as being sustainable? I would argue not 100%, maybe not even 50%, but how big will that niche be? If I would have been standing here 20 years ago and talk about organic and tell you that organic will be going mainstream, I just came from a sabbatical in Germany, and it looked like to me there's 50% of the food is certified organic in retail stores. Are we going to see 50% of Canadian food certified sustainable? Maybe by the end of the century, I don't know, but it's a question that's valid to ask, I think. What is beef? What is the global roundtable for sustainable beef going to do over the coming years? Are they following the footsteps of coffee, or are they going to be developing a standard that is going to be communicated to consumers at all? Maybe not. Maybe it's going to be a pure B2B system. That's going to be an interesting process to follow. And as a major conclusion, after I've done my research for this presentation, is it looks like we know a lot about sustainability standards and other standards on paper, but specifically for sustainability standards, we know hardly anything about the real impact that they have on the ground. Fairtrade tells us that they're buying from small-scale farmers at a premium. That's probably true, but what is the impact of a 10% price premium for these farmers on their livelihood, on poverty levels in coffee-producing countries, and how do these other standards compare in terms of these hopefully measurable outcomes that these standards might have? So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.